Imagine a little boy, the second of 5 children in a middle-class family. His name is Billy. Now, Billy was a smart, sensitive, and funny guy who loved to play tricks on his siblings, and he was very close to his dad. As a matter of fact, Billy's dad was his rock. When Billy was a freshman in college, his dad died suddenly and unexpectedly of a massive heart attack, and Billy took it hard. Eventually, he started experimenting with drugs and quickly found his drug of choice, heroin. Unfortunately, Billy's addiction continued until he almost died of kidney failure. But over the course of the next decade, he was able to reunite with his family. And even though he had not been very present when his own kids were growing up, he was a favorite of his grandkids, who all called him Pawpaw. Billy died 2 years ago, but I learned a lot from him. I learned how trauma and loss can derail a person, robbing them of their life's potential. And I was puzzled. How could someone from such a good family end up with a heroin addiction? And I know many families in America are grappling with the same question now during the opiate epidemic. But the reason this bothered me and kept me looking is that what you don't know is Billy was my brother. I am a physician who specializes in treating eating disorders and addictions. But what I really do is work with survivors of trauma, because the vast majority of my patients with eating disorders and addictions have experienced abuse and neglect, witnessed violence, and suffered numerous losses, most before the age of 18. And that can be devastating. For example, adolescents with a history of abuse and neglect are 3 times more likely to have a drug and alcohol problem than those without. What's true as well is that these individuals come from families where parents and grandparents have also experienced significant trauma. This is what's called intergenerational trauma. Now, the Buddhists have a saying that pain is part of the human condition. That means at some point in our lives, most of us will experience trauma, pain, or loss, or some adversity. Raise your hand if you or someone you know has experienced trauma, loss, or adversity in life. Thank you. The essence of trauma, though, is a loss of a sense of security, safety, trust, and vitality. And what trauma ultimately does is hijack a person's potential in life. Now, as a physician, the scientist in me wanted to know, how could the effects of trauma be passed from one generation to children and grandchildren? And while research is still ongoing, what we do know is childhood trauma does not change the DNA. But the science of epigenetics is showing that it can change the expression of a gene, so that genes for addiction, obesity, depression can be turned on by early life adversity. And this change in gene expression can then be passed to the next generation. This is what's called epigenetic memory. Now, when I looked at my family tree, a tree filled with highly educated, loving, solidly middle-class people, I was shocked to see that it was riddled with trauma and the results of trauma, mental illness, obesity, addictions, and more, all going back generations, all the way back to slavery. And I became determined, some might even say obsessed, with ending the cycle of trauma in my family. Now, you can imagine having a sister, mother, or auntie like me giving you advice whether you want it or not. Eat your veggies. And did you take those supplements I sent you? And what are you going to do about healing your trauma? But seriously, the enigma of hidden trauma is something I see in my patients with eating disorders and addictions all the time, who go into treatment and then relapse again and again and again because their trauma was never addressed. Studies show that 85% of those with addictions who stop using a drug will start using again within just 1 year. When people talk about trauma, it usually takes on the form of all the harm that it causes. And while this is true and important to acknowledge, I'm here to tell you that there are many gifts that can come from trauma, even the trauma that's passed down through the generations. And the biggest gift of all is being able to own your entire life experience. For me personally, exploring the effects of intergenerational trauma in my family brought up so many memories that I had put aside or blocked. Growing up in the segregated South with the colored-only signs, going to segregated schools, I was a little black girl who felt safe and secure as a part of my community. But the outside world was a different story. When I was little, my mama took me shoe shopping, and a white lady in the store came up to her and said, "Where did you get that pretty little white girl from?" And she didn't believe it when my mother told her that I was her daughter. And my child mind wondered, where do I belong? Going to the bank with my grandfather, I saw how this proud, successful man who was a pillar of the black community was treated by the white bankers. And I wondered, will this happen to me one day? And then in the 60s, during the Black Power era, when everyone was proudly sporting their afro hairdos, I couldn't get an afro to save my life. And yes, I tried those tiny little pink foam rollers, and I even got a perm. Just think cloud of frizz when you think of me with a perm. But over time, my identity as a black woman seemed less and less important. It was like a scarf that had just been blown away in a high wind. I didn't feel like I should chase it. I didn't even think I needed it. But in understanding the effects of intergenerational trauma dating back to slavery in my own family, I began to reconnect with my roots as a black woman and reclaim the stories of my ancestors. This is who I am, all of it. Now, while research has a long way to go to prove the mechanism of intergenerational trauma, intuitively, many people are starting to recognize patterns in their own families. I'd like to share an example of this. I have a patient who's a middle-aged woman with a drinking problem. Her mother is a survivor of the Holocaust who coped with her own trauma by shutting down all of her emotions. This inability to connect emotionally is what's called psychic numbing. But my patient experienced this as emotional abuse and neglect. Now, when she had children, she continued the same emotionally distant parenting style with which she had been parented. And by the third generation, the granddaughter is asking, "What's wrong with me? Why can't I handle my problems?" And the original trauma is so far removed that she doesn't even understand why. And this emotionally distant parenting style is now the normal parenting style for this family. And unless interrupted, it will continue on into the next generation. Now, perhaps you're wondering, well, why does this matter? What does this have to do with me? I don't have these problems. But what we do know is that early life adversity, adverse childhood experiences are common. The Center for Disease Control's Adverse Childhood Experiences study has shown that 2/3 of all American households have at least one adverse childhood experience, and 1 in 5 have 3 or more. That means in a room of 100 people, 66 would have had at least one adverse childhood experience, and 20 would have had 3 or more. And this is important because we now know that a history of adverse childhood experiences is associated with an increased risk for addictions, depression, anxiety, obesity, and over 40 medical conditions, including heart disease, diabetes, and cancer. Now, despite this, these traumas can be like buried treasure. Hold on, I pump the brakes for a minute. You may be wondering, how could something so awful be a treasure? I know, I wondered the same thing. But this loss of a sense of security, safety, vitality, and trust can be healed. We can restore relationships within our families. And instead of asking, "What's wrong with you?" we can change the question to, "What happened to you?" Easy for me to say, right? Well, I'm passionate about this because I've had to go through this process myself. My own early life adversities and numerous losses made me the prototype for the strong black woman syndrome. Staying strong for everyone else led to extreme burnout in my 40s and caused difficulties in interpersonal relationships, which my 2 ex-husbands can tell you more about. So perhaps you're wondering, what can you do if you have this in your family? What can you do? Well, number 1, if you know something, share something. Share stories from your past or your family's past as a way to teach resilience to the younger generation. These are difficult topics to talk about, but not talking about them is what keeps us stuck in the past. Secondly, be a friend who's courageous enough to listen to someone who's struggling without judging and without trying to fix their problems. And finally, prevention is best. Understanding intergenerational trauma can reduce shame so that this will enable people to get help for parenting challenges, substance misuse, depression, and suicidal thoughts. What if? What if we could identify children at risk for either because of their own past or their family's past? Could we turn back the clock on the opiate epidemic? Reduce the explosion of mental illness in this country? I like to think of John Lennon's song, and I want to imagine that people will reclaim their personal histories and be liberated from the weight of their past. And more than anything, I'd like to imagine what all this buried treasure can do for you, for me, for our country. Would we be more accepting of our differences, more compassionate with those who are struggling? There is a term in Ghana called Sankofa, which means return and get it. Now you see in the picture, the bird has a precious pebble in its beak. Its feet are moving forward while its head is turning toward the past. This means in understanding who we were, that will free us to embrace all of who we are now. That's what's available to all of us by understanding and healing intergenerational wounds. Thank you.